Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's Exponential webinar in partnership with the Wheaton College Billy Graham Center and the Send Institute. My name is Daniel Yang, and I direct the Send Institute. And in just a little bit, you'll be hearing from Ed Stetzer, our executive director. Today, we're going to be sharing the findings from our third round of surveys. And really what we've been doing over the last few surveys is we're learning how churches are responding in the midst of the pandemic. Exponential has both of those reports available. You can go to exponential.org/COVID and you can download those first two reports. The first survey focused on how church leaders were innovating and adjusting to having to do ministry in quarantine. The second survey focused on how churches were doing financially and how pastors and leaders were doing emotionally and mentally. But in this last round of surveys, our focus is on how churches are returning to in-person worship gatherings, especially as we're moving into the late spring and the summer months. The reason why we think this is crucial is because, number one, we wanted to gauge the preparedness of churches in returning to in-person gatherings. But then number two, we wanted to see how returning to in-person gatherings might play out in the fall, especially if there is a spike of the number of cases of COVID. So today, Ed's going to spend about half the time talking about the four major findings from over 700 responses to the survey. And then in the second half, we'll hear from our friends, Dr. Dhati Lewis. He's the Vice President of the Send Network and the founder and pastor of Blueprint Church. And Tim Hawks, pastor of Hill Country Bible Church in Austin. He's also the founder of the Association of Hill Country Churches, all friends of Exponential. They'll share their experiences as they've talked about planning and preparing to return to in-person worship gatherings. So we want to encourage you throughout the time, go ahead and use the Q&A feature. If you have questions, put it in the Q&A feature. We're going to sort through them as Ed and Dhati and Tim are going along. And then towards the end of the webinar, if we haven't addressed them in the actual interchange, then we'll address them towards the end. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Ed, to reveal the findings of the survey.
Yeah, happy to do it. And of course, we've already posted the link in the chat. I think you'll already see that there. If you want to follow along, you'll be able to see that and download the report from there. And Brooks has already put that in there, I think. Yeah. And there's also too, I'll be posting it. I don't know if we have already or yet, Daniel, you can tell me. It's already a Christianity Today as well. I don't even know. So Daniel will let me know that and I'll reiterate that if it's true. So let's talk a little bit about what we've seen and kind of walk through some of the findings. Because here's the reality. A lot of people are asking the question, when does this gathering, this regathering take place? And what's fascinating is it's actually at different paces and different places. And that's a key phrase, different paces at different places. And another key phrase you'll hear is there's not been a lot of grand openings. There's some gradual reopenings because I think we all kind of hope for a grand opening. And the big picture is people aren't grand opening because in many cases, even when you open, people aren't coming back. So that gradual reopening, helping people to have that confidence of the next step of what they're doing. So let me share my screen and we'll take a look some from the results of the study that we've seen thus far. Keeping in mind too that this is a convenience sample, and a convenience sample is not the same thing as a random sample, but it's going to still be helpful for us in what we're learning and seeing. So let's take a look at what we're seeing thus far. Big picture is churches are experimenting with in-person gatherings, but many are split and unsure about their return. I'm guessing you're already feeling some of that as well. There's a significant number of people who think, why are we waiting? We should be getting back to church. Some of them who are saying that actually are being influenced that the virus is, for example, not that big of a deal, and we're being cowardly if we're not meeting, and if liquor stores are open, churches can be open. On the other side, there's a significant number of people who think we shouldn't be opening. As a matter of fact, this is one of the great challenges, is you literally have people of strong opinion on both sides. And we're actually seeing pastors talk about this as a Romans 14 issue, kind of a preferential issue. But the reality is leadership, well, if you wanted everyone to like you, you have chosen badly. Pastoral leadership is not the place to have everyone in your fan club. And you're going to have some challenges we're seeing even from the data. But let's look at what some of the pastors have reported to us, the pastors and church leaders. And in doing so, a couple of big things, right? Most churches now have the potential to gather at some capacity, but a still large majority have not gathered. Now, it's different in different places. We're going to talk to Tim Hawks in just a bit. I saw that Austin has extended stay at home. Illinois, we're still at the 10-person stage, but the governor, the day before the Supreme Court ruled in his favor, along with California and Illinois. The governor of Illinois actually turned their mandates to guidelines. So churches actually can do anything they want in most places in Illinois, but they're not gathering. Matter of fact, I was on a call with the pastors of the largest churches in Chicagoland, one of the hardest hit areas in the country. And the conversations there talked about emerging in the fall. So you see these different responses, but if you're in Montana, you're like, what are you talking about? So the experience is different in different places. And I think helping us to acknowledge that will help us to recognize why it feels different where you are and where we might be as well. Let's continue to look through the data. Most churches have potential to gather, but a large majority have not yet. 60%, 6% can't gather in person at all. And those are often county issues. California has sort of changed its view, and others have changed this as well. 25% can have up to 50% of their usual attendance. And that's one of the things we're encouraging governors to do, is to work with attendance percentages rather than numbers like 50. And let me explain briefly why, and we can help with some resources on this if you're working with your governor, your county health department. Where I serve as the interim teaching pastor has, it's called Moody Church in downtown Chicago. Well, for one more Sunday, and then I'm done. It has 3,750 seats in the sanctuary. 50 is an irrelevant number. We could have 50 people in the sanctuary and they wouldn't see each other. But at the same time, if you have a building that seats 50 people and you have 50 people in that room, that's disturbing. And that's going to get people sick. So what we're seeing is more and more governors are specifically doing an intentional kind of attendance percentage rather than more broad numbers. 20% are up to 50 people. That's the sum we're hearing as well. But the number of churches that are currently gathering for in-person corporate worship is actually higher than we expected. In some way they're gathering. Currently gathering for in-person corporate worship is 67%. Now, again, keeping in mind what you just saw, some of those are limited and limitations. And so the group that I'm working with, we have 15 pastors in a group. And what we're talking about doing is before we jump into the other side, so do we jump into full worship, is actually to begin to say, let's try 25%. Let's see how the traffic patterns work with people coming in and coming out. Let's see if people will actually follow the guidelines that our church has put down. And I really encourage people not to blame the governor or the county, but for you to say with our elders or your vestry or your session or your board, to say, this is what we've determined. And for example, if you're going to say you're going to wear masks, to say that our church has determined during this season, we're going to wear masks, we're not going to sing. I'm not saying you need to say that, depends on where you are. All this is local now. But I wouldn't say because the governor tells us to, because people are going to push against that, but rather I would say, this is what we've prayed about. This is what we decided. And I would say things like, if you're going to have people wear masks, we're probably going to do masks at most churches in Chicagoland. We're going to say, because we have people in our church who are diabetic, who are recovering from cancer or on chemo, whose kids have asthma and more. And we're going to have to say to people, we expect you to follow those guidelines, because they're going to be our church guidelines set forth from there. Let's take a look at some more. Number of churches gathering in person, 33% return to in-person gatherings, but most are seeing less than half of their congregation attend. So here's what we're seeing. We're seeing, the numbers I'm using is when, and I think I first got this from what Life Church they talked about their gathering, is about 30 to 40% of people are coming back. Now, you're going to find those people who think that this is not that big of a deal and everyone's overreacting. They're going to come back. And I think there's a place and space to say, feel free to come back, follow the guidelines that we put forward. But a whole lot of people are just not rushing back. And this is impacting children's ministry. Many churches just sticking with family worship, which we've done before, Christmas Eve, right? And people do this all over the world. The whole idea of having a nursery and a preschool and age-graded children's ministry, that's not something people do all over the world. And we may have a season when we can't do that as well. So what we're seeing is a sense that the gathering, well, let's take a look at this by number. The gathering is impacted by number, but what I thought was interesting, well, let's take a look at the numbers here. Number of churches gathering in-person corporate worship by church size. It's not that different from person to person that says we're not yet gathering in person, right? With the exception of the larger churches. And I would say that, the exponential audience are all kinds of churches. But if you're a church plant, this is a great time to be a church plant. This is a great time to be a small church. This is not a great time to be Tim Hawks at Hill Country Bible Church. It's not a great time to be at Moody Church because the community is nervous about. I mean, if we were to have a meeting with 3,000 people in Moody Church right now, we would have protesters about what we're doing because they would see it as unhealthy towards them. So, but most people, it's about 2/3 until you get to the larger churches. Number two, half of churches will return to in-person gatherings in June, but almost a third are still not sure yet about their return. So we are seeing now, the survey was taken a week ago, fielded for several days. And we are seeing now June being a key marker point for many. However, in the more heavy hit areas, Dr. Burks said, talked about LA, DC, and Chicagoland as 3 hard hit areas. Now we're seeing some spikes in other places. This is the thing I want you to hear, because we talked about this early on. Josh Laxton and I did a PowerPoint presentation, and we said, you've got to think of yourself as an accordion, not as like we're just opening, right? Even the grand opening will probably be pulled back some. I mean, if you're following the news, Beijing has just shut down extreme drastic measures. So this virus is going to be with us for a while. And there's going to be times we're open and probably the same places are going to close again. So don't think of, all right, we're going to emerge and we're not going to go back. We're probably going to be that accordion level approach for a season. Half all churches will return in June. Let me show you kind of the timeline that churches thus far. We'll just quickly go through this. When did your church return? 18% since at least May, 33% sometime in June. 51% say they return gatherings by the summer, and another 20% of churches are planning to return in the fall. And that's, again, we're in a hard hit area in Chicagoland, so that's part of what we're seeing as well. And of the churches that are not sure when they'll return, it says, will you return to your in-person corporate worship service at your usual facilities? There's just not a level of certainty of what that will look like. Here's the planning to return by June, and notice the huge difference between urban, suburban, and rural. This has been, by and large, a disease that has hit the urban centers of America, and now starting to diffuse out into rural settings. But by and large, this has been a crisis in New York, and you can't I have a friend who lives around Manhattan, and she said, we heard the sirens all day and all night, every day. It never stopped. And 20% of New Yorkers know somebody who died. And so pretty stunning, the New York experience, but it's so different than the Iowa experience. And so you have to recognize this is not one experience for people. And you see these numbers, and it's overwhelming that people are looking to come back in June in rural areas and much less sure in urban areas. So large and urban are two things that are making it harder for a lot of as well. Not sure about the return. Urban, much higher numbers there as well when you look at by context. Number three, a significant number of church leaders feel their members are split on whether to return right now. And we'll come back to that more in just a minute, but there's 3 priorities of church leaders have sort of bumped around. And I was kind of hoping and interested to see what it was going to look like whether that in person would shrink down. I was unsure, but still the service is still a driving issue. The service is still a driving issue for a lot of people. Evangelism number 3. Let me encourage you, make that evangelism a higher priority as well. That's a passion for us, of course, here at the Billy Graham Center, and I think ultimately for all of us to press in on. So when asked about the level of influence church members had on returning to corporate worship, the church member influence was rather interesting, is that some influence to return sooner, that's about 38%. Some influence to wait longer, so there are more people wanting to return than not return. And then some people saying it's just not been a major influence on our conversation. Sometimes maybe because of the community laws or else may be. I thought this was interesting. Which following best describes the church situation? It's a little hard to see, but you can kind of lean close to your screen. The 28% say the church is close to evenly split on returning, and you can kind of see the rest. And Some just say, I'm not sure. A large majority support returning. But for most people, it's just split. Now, rural tends to be more wanting to return, rural not to. Large churches, less so. So it follows the pattern of what we're talking about. And churches are split on generally across the nation about returning. And so number 4 on our outline, state leadership is actually the greatest factor on why churches are waiting longer to reopen, while federal and denominational leadership have at least some influence overall. Again, to Daniel Yang's Canadian, and so I should say apologize to our Canadian friend, or planted in Canada, to our Canadian friends, but we mainly asked the question around state. But I know from talking to church planners and pastors in Canada, it's similar. It's not the national setting the agenda anymore, like it was in March and April, and particularly when the month-long shutdown. Now it's more state by state, depending upon the level of spread and more. So we actually asked people to rate kind of what was influential to them. And, in deciding this, let me share some of the questions that we asked them. They could choose several different options. You'll see denominational leadership. Some denominations have said, we're not meeting. And if you say that and you're a hierarchical denomination, you'll follow those guidelines. It could be local. President Trump calling on churches to, quote, essential places of faith to open right now. We want to know how big of an impact that had on people, our church members, our church leaders. Here's what we saw. Biggest by far is state and provincial leadership. We've now moved to that level where it's a state by state issue. But one of the things we find in Illinois, the governor here, Governor Pritzker, divided us into regions. And the Chicagoland region is the region that's hit hard, but Southern Illinois is not. So that's even been a challenge. But then local, this is those categories that had the largest percentage indicating some to significant influence to wait longer. And so local municipal leadership, church leaders, our church members, for those to influence to return sooner was our church members and our church leaders. The largest category actually with no influence was President Trump's call to open essential places right now. I think partly, of course, this is just my professional judgment. I didn't follow up survey people. I think the timing on that was very soon for where most states were. So 61% said that didn't have any influence on them. However, 34% indicated that the president's statement had some to significant influence to return sooner. So, and again, it'd be interesting to see how we divide that down by state. And my guess is there would be a statistically significant difference. Also, denominational network leadership didn't have that much influence. Again, it appears because in part, this is more of a local decision now than it is a state or a national decision. And federal leadership, national leadership, actually not a particularly great area of influence as well. So big conclusion, right? Regardless of whether churches are meeting in person or not, this summer is a wonderful time to take advantage of granting leaders rejuvenation and vision for the next season. And we're going to talk some more about that in the questions in the Q&A. Let me say a couple more things about some of the financial questions, because I want you to be aware. And we chose not to answer financial questions in this round. We're not reporting here because what's happened is we did early on, and we were the first data out in this partnership that we had with these these next steps of how finances were impacting churches. So then with that being said, we wanted to ask the question, where can we find more information on finances? Well, the great thing is the ECFA, that's the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability. Many of us are members of that organization as well. They've actually just done a survey, just came out with a survey that follows some similar patterns that we've seen before, with a couple of exceptions. And so this is all, Warren Bird put this together, and the good work of the ECFA is here as well. This is just taken right out of their PDF and shared with you. So here's the good news, is churches are optimistic about cash donations. But if you remember the last two surveys we did, churches were optimistic then. And one of the cautions I had for you is that their optimism sort of overshadowed, or maybe it was more optimistic than their numbers would indicate they should be optimistic. And so churches are still optimistic. Part of that may be because pastors have read the end of the book and Jesus wins. And so they're always, God's at work right around the corner, is a breakthrough. And I'm always praying for that too, and you are as well. So, but let's take a look at what the actual numbers now tell us. we can actually look and see that optimism is similar across all budget sizes. And similar, follows a similar pattern, a bit of an outlier of the 5 to 10 million, but let's be honest, that's not most of you here in this conversation anyway. The optimism is highest among those whose income grew in recent years. So in other words, if the income of the church was growing already, it seemed to continue positively. If there was going poorly, well, that negative trend may have continued. Older churches show, which this is a surprising, show slightly more optimism, right? So perhaps because they're more stable, we don't know for sure. April year to cash giving was similar or higher. Now this is important because what this means is it's not just the optimism now. There are actually numbers that after kind of the stunning March and then the huge growth of unemployment in April, that actually giving in most places stayed relatively similar, the same or higher. And so you can actually see a recent cash giving was the same or higher comparing April to January. So you actually see when you compare April year over year, and you compare April to January. Remember January 2020? That was like 14 years ago in COVID time. But you'll see the difference between the giving is actually up in all of those cases. Many of them applied for the most applied for the Paycheck Protection Program, and the least likely were large churches to do so. So I think it's good and fair to say that optimism outweighs uncertainty, and there's reason for that now that was not there in some of the earlier studies where we saw a disproportionate hit in giving for rural churches, for urban churches, and for smaller churches as well. So that kind of gives us a picture of the finances, that gives us a picture of the regathering. I'm going to turn it back over to Daniel, and then we'll continue our conversation and ask some questions related to that. And then a little bit later on, we'll take your questions as well.
Great, thanks, Ed. I'm going to bring on Tim and Dahadi here, and Ed and I are going to just have a quick discussion with them in terms of just what they're seeing on the ground. And Tim, I know you're out there in Austin, and Dahadi is out there in Atlanta, and so I know not all the contexts are going to be the same. But what's going to be helpful as listeners are tuning in is to hear the range of responses in the midst of the pandemic right now. And Tim, you pastor Hill Country out in Austin. Would you mind sharing just, you've been meeting for a couple of weeks now. Can you help us to understand the decision-making process that went into deciding how to start meeting in person and what those meetings actually look like?
Sure, Daniel. It was an interesting process, to say the least. One of the things I discovered in the whole, just the whole mindset of our leadership team, we typically make decisions as a group, and I realized that they were looking to me to tell them what I felt like we needed to do. So it was very interesting, the dynamic. The other thing I would just say, and then I'll answer your question, but how churches talk about why they are opening or not opening actually sets a tone in the community that unifies churches or pitches churches against each other. And so we were very thoughtful about that. And even in this conversation, because I'm giving you the reasons why we opened, that's not a statement that I think we're right and other people are wrong if they do something else. So first of all, our high value on public worship, we believe the church needs to be visible in the community. That's a high priority for us. And there are a lot of the benefits of people being together. The second thing that we leveraged was when our governor came out and said that churches are essential services. And I looked at the inequities created by that. In other words, we're asking very significant numbers of people to continue on the food supply chain, being in our hospitals, working. In many cases, these are people of lower income, so we're putting those folks at risk because we need food, we need medicine, we need those things. So I felt like that was in some ways a call to the church to step into a space of greater risk to be able to meet the spiritual needs of our community. And we have you know, kind of I wouldn't say affluent, but definitely people are getting paid by their employer, even if they're not showing up for work. And I just felt like that was important for us to step in and begin to provide an essential service. And then the final thing was just looking at how people behave. There are early adopters and late adopters, and there's a lot of fear around these kinds of issues. So we felt like the sooner we broke the ice and got started and let the early adopters come, we felt like the late adopters are going to adopt late anyway. They're not going to come for several months. So we felt like the later we opened, the later we would see people feeling comfortable to come.
I think that's helpful. And let me follow up too. And we're going to get to Dottie in just a moment. Dottie's going to give us some insight both on Blueprint Church, but also on Church Planters as well, what they're doing. He serves and leads as vice president of the North American Mission Board. But Tim, well, who showed up the first? I mean, you've been 2 weeks in. Are you following, blank percent? Did you limit capacity? Did you create seat reservations? And who showed up?
So we're actually 5 weeks in.
Okay.
So we were one of the first churches in our city. There was one other church that went before us, and we were second. And essentially what we found out, at first we went with the 25%, which was the governor's guidelines, and the CDC guidelines, 6 feet separation, everybody wearing masks and so forth. And it looked like I was talking to a handful of people scattered across a huge room. Yeah. There was huge excitement, applauding, standing up, clapping, but there was nobody here. And so over the 5 weeks, we have averaged 11% of our normal Sunday morning attendance. We introduced K through 4-year-olds this past week. So we've been able to meet the guidelines to do that. And we've increased our capacity in the worship center. We've also gone to a mask optional, which significantly increased our attendance, and a mask required services. So those people who want to be in a mask required, they can come. But we were very prescriptive at first. We had a big registration system, and we learned, like Life Church, it actually takes more work to set it up and manage it for the number of people that want to come. There's just not enough people coming to need that kind of management. And people want to be able to do what they want to do. And if you're overly prescriptive in our situation, we just found that was an obstacle.
Yeah, you're Texas. Texas has a whole different feel. Singing or no singing?
Singing.
Okay. And
so we created space. So there was distance between the platform and the first few rows of people. But we sang. Singing in masks is not the worst thing. In fact, actually, people did well with that.
Yeah.
So
good. Let's go to Hadi and Tim. I know you have church planners in your network as well. We're going to talk about that and come back to you. But to Hadi, you're having to advise literally hundreds and hundreds of church planners through the Send Network. What are you, and Blueprint too, but what are you seeing with church planters as they begin to start re-emerging? I'm guessing it's probably different in different states and provinces. Are there any patterns you're seeing? Oh, you got to unmute. It's just not a Zoom call if somebody doesn't say you got to unmute.
Yes. No, what you said, I think it really brings together the thought when you said pace, different spaces and paces. I mean, that is the reality. I mean, we're representing North America, basically, where Send Networks is hitting 3 different countries, and just the multiplicity of different things, all the way trying to navigate all the things that you went through in your presentation, I think is the reality that we have. And so we're trying to just kind of give people guidelines and really just trying to kind of learn from the field. And so we have put out just different COVID responses. If you are at a place to open, here's certain things, more than trying to give specifically, this is what you need to do or whatever open. So we have left it up to the church's discretion, and all that. But what we're seeing is that a lot of our, of our church plants are remaining online, and they're staying online and they're connecting, in that format. But what we found a lot is that a lot of our church plants are depending on school systems, and the school system is closed. And when the school system being closed, that they don't have any options. So they're not only worrying about like, okay, now it's not left up to them, because even after the, like in the fall, if the school system still determines that it's not safe and they're not going to open, that hinders the church. And so we are, so we're having some of our churches having to reimagine, because what does gathering in spaces look like, because of the fact that we can't, because they are left up to the discretion of whoever they're leasing from.
Yeah, let me add to that. When those schools open, in a lot of places, we're already hearing schools saying, but no outside people will be allowed. No parents visiting the school, and that includes no groups renting on the weekend. So we don't even know what this means yet in the fall. So huge hit for that. What about Blueprint itself? Atlanta's been hard hit in more of the urban context. Are you gathering?
Yeah, well, we're not gathering currently. No, we are not gathering. And right now, we know that we're not going to gather in live at the very minimum until August. Right now, we just felt like it's better to put a date on and to aim for that date. And so right now, we're aiming for the first Sunday in August as the date. However, we are doing a one drive-in service. So the first time we've done on July the 5th. So we're doing kind of a July 5th drive-in service on one of our locations, and just kind of, it's a parking lot, which we have seen many people already do. But we are also, just all of your stats were like dead on for us. I mean, we have a large part of our congregation that says, even when we hope, and we're not. So we've already told them that we will continue our online service indefinitely. So we will. So even on the time in July when we do the drive-in service, we will still have an online option. So we're not taking a hard stance on but there are a group of people who saying that, we're weak, we're whatever, we're not, because of.
And that's just your wife. That's just your wife telling you.
Yeah, I know that is. That's my wife. So I got to tell my wife to stop, complaining. But the other thing that plays a part of this for us is specifically what's going on on the social side.
Sure.
The issue that we feel like, and that's kind of a conversation that us as a leadership, we feel like we can better mobilize our church to address the racial injustices that's going on right now by being gathered together. And so that's a huge consideration for us, specifically with the latest this past weekend with Rayshard Brooks, with the police.
Wendy's in Atlanta, yeah.
And so we're just, because literally we have members that live less than a mile. One of our members actually was there.
Wow.
And so it's being able to wrestle and to navigate. And so like, as we address the variety of different things, and so that comes into play with, so we are, when we do open, we're going to be doing it in stages. It's not going to be an all call. We already got the church, the sanctuary set up in a way of what we can feel like. And sort of the percentages is kind of a lot of the stuff that we're going about and how we're attacking the issue.
Let me ask a question, follow up on that, Dahadi, to either both of you and Tim. In your leadership gatherings, as you're talking to leaders, and I'm trying to combine a couple of questions that have come here through the Q&A. What are some of the things that you were trying to learn first before you made the decision of when you were going to meet? And it sounds like, there's a lot of things that you're taking into consideration, but, there's definitely the safety issues, but then there's staffing issues. You don't want to stretch your staff too much. Now you have to maintain both the online, which some people are already doing, but there's online and in-person gatherings. And then there's pastoral care that needs to be spread across in-person and online. So can you talk about like your staff conversations around these things?
For us, basically, we said we have to look at it in four areas, and they were all distinct areas that we talked about. And there was certain categories for each one. So the first area was obviously the Sunday gathering, right? Like, how are we going to bring the Sunday gathering? The other one was the building, reopening the building, and what does that look like for us reopening the building? The other one was our staff. Like, do we have our staff in? So that was another, just the utilization of that and staff. And then the final one was our city groups, meeting in homes, and and each one of them has a variety of different circumstances and dynamics. And so we looked at each one of those and basically created a plan. And here's the things that we would like to see in order for us to do that in the different stages. And one doesn't have to be connected to others. So for us, staff, we've kind of measured that, and we've decided to go to a remote staff working indefinitely right now. And so there's an indefinite kind of staff, and we created a new rhythm around that, and that's going to be the new rhythm 4 years. Same thing in terms of our elder gatherings. So there's certain things that we are doing like we've just made a decision for the year, regardless of what, like, here's just the new normal. Let's just kind of settle into the new normal. But then there are certain things that we are waiting, like a decrease in, healthcare. Like, so there's the factors that we're creating. And then we're also, I mean, to Ed's point, is we can open up to where we have people who want to volunteer, and to be in those. And so, like, all of those factors. And so we are doing surveys, we're doing things. And that's one of the things that, we just said, like, well, we're spending a lot of time in leadership. Let's just ask the people, like, why do we need to spend all this time and then them come back and like, I don't know why you always talk about that, because I'm not coming anyway. And so it's just like, so where are you? So that's where we're just doing a lot. But what we've found in all of the research is that there are a percentage of people who are ready to come back. And so we're going to create that for them, but there's a large percentage that's not ready. So we're going to also minister to them. And so we're coming in, what we would say is that it's a both and. We don't, so it's like, and because we have 2 campuses where we could do multiple locations, we feel like we can service the base of people who are ready, who say that they're ready to come without, and still social distance, where we can get everybody, but we don't have to put anybody who doesn't want to be in harm's way, guilt them into coming to make me feel better. Because, that's what it's really all about. It's about making me feel better.
Well, that's why I actually go to churches, so you, Dhati, would feel good. So a couple of things. Key things to hear, as you heard from Tim, and now repeated from Dhati, is that people are not rushing back. And and I think that's been a surprise to a lot of people. Again, not a grand opening, but a gradual reopening. This means probably large group evangelism. So that whole Christmas Eve big outreach service you're planning, that's probably not going to happen this year. They're going to have a different approach. So keep that in mind as well. Also, too, Dhati mentions having a date. The language we're encouraging pastors to use is we are planning, he said August, we're planning to meet in August. Our churches in South Carolina are planning to open in September. But we can't promise because we don't know what ultimately will happen, and that flexibility is going to be key. So there's a pastor friend of mine that all of us know. His initials are Larry Osborne, and he had been reminding people, and with I think a helpful caution, don't open until your in-person experience is as good as your online experience. And like I sometimes do, I disagree with Larry Osborne. But Larry wrote a whole book about how he disagreed with everybody about everything. So I'm actually good with that. Because I think in a sense, Tim, just back to you for a quick question. I mean, it's not a great experience for you, but there's a significant number of people who want it. You've got to get in the practice and the pattern of having it. So is that a good thing? Should we start with, and you're having like 10%. I mean, do you start there?
For me personally, I believe we need to start there. And Dhati, I wish I was as smart as you to start asking our people early instead of just deciding, because we have a very broad opinion. And in fact, for the first time, I've seen people boycott the church over political reasons, because we ask people to wear masks and they think we're falling into the wrong camp in their political view, so they're going to boycott the church. So that's the kind of breadth of opinions of people, whether they'll come, whether they won't come. So it's really kind of the Wild West from the standpoint of people you think you think you understand where they're coming from, and you might not find out. And then there's also the extended family connections of, I'm perfectly feeling comfortable going out, but I've got a mother that I'm taking care of and I can't come. So, but I do think getting your feet in the water is a big deal, because people have been shell-shocked by the shelter-in-place orders, and getting out the door is an important thing. Walking into a worship space is an important thing. I don't think you do it just to do that. You have to have all the other reasons in place and the thoughts in place. But I do think if you can do a live worship service and you feel led to do it, even if it might not be the best experience for the people, I think it starts the process of people coming back into a public space.
Tim, can I ask you, you said that you just started doing K through 4 child ministry again. Can you talk about what that looks like? What's some of the preparation that's gone into that?
So essentially, the kind of the second wave of CDC orders made it possible to do it. At one point, it was if a child touches a toy, you have to pick it up and remove it from the room and clean it and so forth. So there is, there is a level where kids can be in the same room together. They can actually touch certain surfaces, but there's a limited number that you can put in each room. The child care workers have to have, gloves, and they have to wear masks, which becomes a pretty big deal for kids because a lot of kids get scared. It's very, very controlled. And what we found is the majority of people still aren't ready to bring their kids. And until daycares open up and most people are taking their kids to daycare, the idea that I'm going to bring my kid to church is low. So, we're planning for children in the hundreds when we would normally plan for children in the thousands. So it's just a very small number of people that are doing it. And it's hard.
Quick question, follow up to that. Have you seen a lot of a lot of the nursery workers tend to be disproportionately older women? Have they wanted to serve, or did you lose a significant number of volunteers?
Significant number of volunteers. My suggestion is to think in terms of you need to rebuild your volunteer force. So when you start thinking about, here are all the people I can count on. They always show up and serve whenever that's not the way it is. I've got an executive pastor who's just had a grandbaby, and he needed to be off for 14 days before he could be here present, and that's just a reality. So these are really different times.
Yeah,
we've closed 2 campuses that meet in schools, and we are not planning to reopen them because we don't think we're going to need the space. So our executive team sat down the last 2 days, and we've got 100 staff members, and we are reassigning every person on our staff for the new reality. So it is whatever. So I tell our team, whatever you were doing in the past, whatever we were doing in the past, we did well. So we can go back to that if we ever get there. Now we need to learn what it could look like in the future, and we all need to pivot to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's probably why the summer is an important thing for your church leadership, to condition them, to get them, in your case, maybe do some reassigning around their ministry job description. Dahani, as you're thinking about meeting in the late summer, what are you doing with your church leadership over the summer to strengthening them, to getting them to think about mission again? What are some of the things that you're doing around training and equipping over the summer?
Yeah, there's 3 things that I've been trying to hit and kind of hit the drum on, that everything else fit in the categories, but how do we become advocate leaders, missional leaders, and repentant leaders? Advocate because of the racial tension. And really, I'm a firm believer that what Jesus said, when he says, the world will know you're my disciples because of your love for one another. And, just us being unified in advocating, the ministry of reconciliation. So how do we approach this climate as advocates, ministers of reconciliation, running to injustice, but running with a heart for reconciliation? Missional leaders, how do we take that, and be kind of outwardly focused? So how are we helping to mobilize the church to do that, and how are we equipping them? And so really leveraging and utilizing this time for the purpose of being able to unleash and mobilize our leaders to be outwardly focused, because the Great Commission is still the call. So how can we do that? And I don't think that we need to divorce, kind of the issues that's going on. That's just the current problem. But what is the answer? And how do we equip people with the answers so that we can bring glory to Christ and ultimately bring people into a saving knowledge of Christ. So how can we equip our people to be both missional as they're engaging the real issues of our society with the gospel? How do we do that? And so we're spending a lot of time to think outwardly, because the reality is, until there's a vaccine, I don't really see there's going to be the up and down, the accordion kind of approach that we're going to have to do. And so we just have to think missionally, like consistently and missionally. And so that's a big one. And then the final one is repentant. Repentant leaders basically is this, like, constantly, how are we helping our people to see Jesus in a different way? Right. And this is really the idea of repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. So I'm not talking about repenting from the bad things that you've done, repenting from the idea of how are we seeing Christ in a new way? Because we've put Christ in a box for so many years. And I know churches for years have been saying he's more than a Sunday service. He's more than, but we haven't fleshed out any type of structure, any type of thing that really says that he's more than. And so we're really trying to get our people to relook at the person and work of Jesus, relook at the gospel, relook and to say, what does it look like where Jesus never had a church service, like a building to gather his people, and and even many of the apostles of old, there was so being able to kind of repent and to look afresh, look anew at Jesus, and look at it. So the Beatitudes have been really informative for me over this time, and really getting our people to look, because that's what COVID-19 has told us. Blessed are those who are powerless, poor in spirit, right? We are powerless. We don't know. We have no control. And that's what, this whole conversation is basically a big conversation about, we don't know. We don't have any control. That's what this conversation is about. We're poor in spirit. So, second, blessed are those who mourn. Hey, I'm grieving, I'm angry, I'm sad, like all of these things. And so those who are able to grieve the sadness of this will do better at this. We're sad, so let's grieve. But blessed are those who continue to hunger and thirst. So even though we're powerless, we're sad because we're not in control, let's keep hungering, let's keep thirsting, because it's the gospel. This is the Beatitudes. Jesus, the Bible has equipped us to impact any day, any society. And so that's really, I'm just trying to point my people to go, let's go to the scriptures, Christ has said something to it, and he's speaking to this time, so let's just keep doing it. And we just keep walking through the Beatitudes. And so, so we've been really leaning on, so when I mean repentant, that's what I mean is let's look at Jesus once again. Let's look at him once again. So yeah.
I could hear you preach that all day, and I think you're right on. And I appreciate that this is not just about disease. So we're dealing with, in the midst of all this, the virus of racism. We're dealing in the midst of all this with an economic collapse. It's multifaceted, and appreciate us remembering that. So we're going to go through questions, and I've got several of them here, and you probably see the Q&A just like I do. So some of them we already answered. Kevin asked, what are churches doing about singing together, initial physical meeting stage, less songs with masks? I think, Tim, you said with masks, then you opened it up to people. You had a service without masks. By the way, I think it's a great idea, because again, a significant number of people are not going to be, they got a kid who's got asthma, and you've got to just remember that. Have you done less singing, or do you just keep we'll make these quick answers if you can. Have you kept the amount of singing the same?
The same.
Okay. So about there. Okay. So we've done that one, and let's see. 8 Madeline asks, what are the 5 disciple-making churches in the U.S.? I don't know. What are they doing to adjust to COVID-19? Dahadi, you've been very passionate about discipleship for as long as I've known you. How are you discipling people while you're doing it from a physical distance?
Online. So, I'm Zoom calls. We've created multiple strategies where we'll get people in a group together, and then we'll have breakout rooms. And so we'll have breakout Zoom rooms for them to go to get to the personal thing. So we're really encouraging our people utilize Zoom by, helping, giving them, if they don't have the access to it, giving them access to things. We are taking everything. We've continued with our residency, our pipelines, all of that, and it's all been via Zoom, and actually in a lot of ways, we are going to keep that, even that's what it's talking about. We're going to keep it throughout the rest of the year.
Yeah.
Because we don't know what to expect. So Zoom has been the primary.
Zoom is the new discipleship means. Leaf Oines asks, and I guess Tim will ask you this, when you started using a reservation system, what did you use?
So Life Church has put together a system called Brushfire, And so we've used that. I don't know if they're going to continue to develop it because they've discovered the same thing that we have. There's not enough people coming to merit all the work and communication to get that system in place and use it.
Yeah, it is fascinating. I think the assumption was that you'd have a whole bunch of people and there'd be a rush to the 10 o'clock service and no one wants to go to the 8 o'clock service. Well, it turns out not all people want to go to the 10 o'clock service either. So I think that's part of the challenge. The one other question, and then I'll turn to Daniel, ask some questions as well. Again, Leaf Oines is asking the question, and I'm going to just make it more broader than I think the way he was asking the question, is they were talking about what sort of air movement system and are people installing or using in their context. I would also say too, are you using foggers or disinfectants? I guess we could ask you, Tim, because Dhati's not yet meeting, but what about air and disinfectant are you doing?
So both of our buildings are modern buildings that have a push air system in them with high ceilings and plenty of air movement. So that wasn't an issue. The fogger thing, I've seen people use those. One of the biggest challenges was we could get the equipment, but we couldn't get the solution. And so we came up with alternative, basically people going around and wiping things off and so forth. But the fogging thing is a great idea, especially for children's areas.
Yeah, I actually saw that the Chicago Kent Muncie, who's at the Chicago Hillsong Church. It's called Chicago City Church, but it's part of the Hillsong family. We were on a call and he shared the fogger that they were getting, and they had the resources. And because what do you do between services? So I mean, you've got to do that between, and of course, not all foggers will work on all of our kind of furniture as well. You can't do that on certain kinds of wood and things of that sort. Daniel, back to you for the questions.
Sure. And Russ Holt, he just shared here that ThunderTix, he says, is a great app for seat reservation. So that may be something that you all might want to check out. ThunderTix, T-I-X is how you spell that. Dhati, I want to go to you. We've got a couple more minutes here. We have a unique opportunity here in pandemic. We, for the most part, are meeting in some decentralized format. How do you see multiplication? What's the opportunity? I want to ask Dhati, and then Tim also wants you to jump in as well, because you both are involved in church multiplication. What's the opportunity for multiplication right now from your perspective?
Well, I mean, I think one of the biggest opportunities and what we're trying to push is discover, develop, and deploy people from within. I think obviously when you're not out as often or as frequent, and you're more so in the, like, you begin to look as Jesus, like the harvest is plentiful, but the labors are few. I think this is a good time that they're thinking about things beyond. But the problem is that you can now find out whether your people are equipped to actually go. And so like us going specifically into those people that discovering, developing, deploying those people from within, like, and saying like, I have 331, for us, like at our, it was like 331 covenant members. And we're saying, hey, do we have a plan for every one of our covenant members? And so for when you're a smaller size church, we can say that, because the bottom line is that what you've heard me say before, I have 6 children. If I told you I was only discipling 4 out of my 6 children, you wouldn't be pleased with that. So the only acceptable answer is 6 out of 6. So we're trying to just apply, again, the principles that we already have in our church. Every covenant member, we say a call to membership is a call to discipleship. And when we're talking about this is the best time, you have a captive audience with your covenant, with your members, to equip them, to bring the focus on them, to help them become a missional leader, because you could multiply people, then you'll multiply churches, and then you multiply churches, you have a multiplying movement. And so that's where we're focusing in on.
Great. Focus on the people. Tim, what about you? I mean, you planted several churches, Austin area, beyond. What are the opportunities for multiplication you're seeing right now?
So I think for the first time, we're envisioning beginning to plant churches from an online standpoint first. And we're also starting to look at younger church planters that have a high network in cyberspace, but maybe a low personal development at this point. In other words, even working with high school students who may have a huge gaming community or something, and start training them in how to bring the gospel in, how to begin to work as leaders, with a view that these kids are going to grow up as church planters from the get-go. So lots of things around envisioning discipleship and church planting with people that you don't have to be in front of directly. So we're also very committed to raising up church planters from within, and we're giving people space to really explore how to develop missional communities online. How to gather people in the neighborhood that you would not normally show up at your house, but they're looking for people to connect with now. We've seen real success with that. And providentially, 2 years ago, we planned a citywide evangelistic campaign, working through John Burke's book, Imagine Heaven. So what an interesting topic to be talking about near-death experiences and what the Bible says about the afterlife when everybody's thinking about death. And so we have heavily leveraged evangelism through that and have seen people engaged in conversations online with parents and family members around the country and in the neighborhoods with friends and family that would have never talked about life after death. So huge outreach opportunity if you can connect people together, and that's really what we're focused on at this point.
One thing that I would just add to that, into what I was saying, that's spot on, is that we have to stop trying, when it comes to multiplication, we have to stop trying to multiply only the called, and we need to start focused on more of the qualified, right? Like, and I think that's what one of our pastors in DC, Clint, basically just talks about. Like, so many of us are worrying about the people who are called, and we create systems for calling, to in terms of multiplication, instead of just looking at, no, you meet the qualifications. I'm gonna let God work on the call, right? But I'm gonna work and I'm going to equip the qualified. I'm going to help you to be trained, and then, and I think that is something that the leaders that we're missing so often, because we're waiting for, basically, when we talk about the call, oftentimes we're waiting for them to take the first step. Hey, I feel called to ministry. You know how it goes. I feel, and then we, instead of us approaching them.
Well, I think there's a whole lot of people right now that are deployed at a higher level than they have been before, but they're leading small groups or missional communities, and they're the pastors who are going to be planting churches in 2 years or 6 months. And so the opportunity here is great, because we can actually look and see what's God doing through this person, and they're going to be part of a church planting team. They didn't even think about it yet. So I love Tahati. I could listen to you all day and twice on Sunday. So let's talk about metrics, because one of the realities is, there's kind of a traditional way of planting churches. It's a weird thing to think of planting churches as traditional, but we start with a small groups, then we do preview services, then we go to a launch service. What do we need to be thinking about metrics now for church planting? Both of you are heavily invested and engaged in church planting. What is church planting success in the summer of 2020 and the fall of 2020? We'll go first to Tim and then to Tahati.
So I would say bivocational becomes a really big issue because the idea of going out and renting space, if you could even find it, and building a face-to-face gathering in a climate where people are leery of meeting together is just not on the table. So I think we're talking about multiplying lots of people into missional behavior online and seeing the ones that God blesses and seeing if they can grow a community of people that are really engaged, growing in discipleship and connecting with each other before we say, okay, be a full-time person. So metrics in many ways changes significantly, because this is very viral, in my opinion, at this point in time.
Yeah, let me encourage you not to use the word viral in the future answers, if you don't mind, Tim.
That's pun intended.
Keeping in mind that I actually wrote a whole book on church multiplication movements called Viral Churches, which in hindsight, anyway. Tahati, what about you? What would you talk about with new metrics?
Well, I think we for us, it's it is mobilization and the impact of the mobilization, right? So like for me, it's how many of our people are actually engaged. And so we're doing a lot of measuring the actual impact of people's engagement, like asking them diagnostic questions and saying like, how are you involved, instead of just saying, so like this, asking them those types of questions and impacting. So and we do it around three primary, really four core aims of just gospel, family, mission, and then basically stewardship. And so those are kind of the four. And so like how, so we don't tell them what, we just says how, like, how has the Spirit led you? Because that's what we're accountable for, all believers. So we're not trying to put on a formula, but we are calling you to engage. So like mobilization, how are you mobilizing in gospel, family, mission, and stewardship? And then the second one is the impact. Okay, what has the fruit? Have we seen any fruit, from your impact? And so just basically reducing it, keeping it very simple, like you're supposed to be in the game. Are you in the game? And what are the fruit? And being able, we have a very a system where we are trying to follow up and call, and that's just a part of our discipleship program whole system. So it's not something that we're doing new for in the COVID-19, but just being able to ask that is like, how do we do that? So that's how. And now so what's different really, Ed, is not the kind of the what we're doing, because it's not necessarily new of the what, but it's more of now we're measuring different type of results. It's a different type of impact of that, how they're having because of the circumstances.
That's great. Hey, I want to thank Dhati and Tim. Thank you for taking time to share. I want to illustrate in this conversation, you saw that we started off talking about churches returning to in-person worship gatherings and how important that is. But because for the vast majority of us, we still can't yet gather, or we're not at the point where we're thinking about gathering. You notice that the conversation went to how do we continue to prepare and equip our believers and our saints for the work of mission. And that never goes away. That has always been our mission and our aim. That's the mission of the Wheaton College Billy Graham Center. That's the mission of Exponential. And that's why we've partnered together for this. So thanks, Ed, for bringing the data for us today. As you guys continue to move into the summer, I want to encourage you to think about leadership rejuvenation. We have resources at resilientchurchleadership.com that you might be interested in. Think about what you can do to help convert your small groups into missional communities. Some of the things that Dhati talked about, use this summer as a chance to really re-envision what mission looks like in the place that you're in. Thank you to Brooks and his team. You go to exponential.org/COVID to update the latest reports and to catch the replay if you'd like to share it with anybody else. God bless you all. Thanks for joining us today.